Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of GMAT 101 with Stacy. We are in the era of the GMAT Focus edition, as we all know, and applicants, including me, have a lot of questions about this new version. Questions about scoring algorithms and the inconsistencies, the difficulty level of the new official mocks, newly added sections, and a lot more. So, in order to address all these concerns, we have exclusively organized a 5 episode series with Manhattan Prep, a name that we're all familiar with. And I have here with me Stacey Cochrans, a seasoned GMAT expert who is here to simplify our lives and make the GMAT easier for us. So, before we begin, a big thumbs up to Stacey and Manhattan Prep for making this happen. And this is episode 1 of the series. Today, we will be discussing the scoring algorithms and the unusual behavior that we've observed, the relevance of the first 10 questions on the paper, and section adaptability. In the upcoming episodes, we will cover the difficulty level of the new official mocks, how to best use the changing answers feature, and what do we do if our test gets flagged for review. It's a panic point, and we get it, which is why we've organized this series to understand all of this a lot better. So, if you want to get notified about the upcoming sessions and join in for this entire series, make sure that you hit the subscribe button and press the bell icon. So, without further ado, and we only have 30 minutes, and I have a list of questions. So, let's get started. Hello, Stacey. Welcome to this session, and thank you so much for joining us.
I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to talk about this stuff. So, thank you for asking me.
Okay, so the first category that I broadly want to touch upon is the changes in the scoring algorithm and the score anomalies, right? Let's begin with the scoring algorithm on the GMAT Focus edition. Has it changed since the Classic edition? If yes, then how? Moreover, recently we have received a couple of reports on the GMAT Club where we have observed certain scoring anomalies wherein the percentiles and the accuracy were not in sync. For instance, we have a slide here that we will soon be checking. In the first example, right, the percentile remained the same despite getting an incorrect extra question. And in the second instance, we can notice how the percentile in fact increased. Now, I must clarify that these are exceptions, does not affect everyone, but we still want to know from you how exactly does the algorithm work and how does this affect things for us?
Definitely. So they did make some changes to the algorithm from the old exam to the new exam. The changes actually weren't as extensive, but they also did change the scoring scale. So part of what we're seeing going on here, I wouldn't actually call these anomalies. There's a reason for what's going on, and we'll talk about what that is. It just feels weird. But the thing you're talking about right now is not actually different from the old exam to the new exam. It was the case on the old exam, as it is the case in the new exam, that your score is a function of, I'm going to call it more a function of the difficulty levels of what you're getting right and wrong, as opposed to the number of things that you're getting right and wrong. So on the old exam, you could actually get more questions wrong and get a higher score than somebody else who got fewer questions wrong, and they would get a lower score. So that still exists on the new exam, and it did exist on the old exam. There's a complication that was introduced with the new exam with I think a good new feature that they introduced, which is that you can change up to 3 answers at the end of the section now. But that also introduces changes to the scoring. And so, for example, for the ones that we're looking on the screen, Avijit and I talked about this a little bit before the session, and he went and did some digging to find out. I asked him, did some of these people, especially the people at the top of the list, did they have questions that they changed from wrong to right at the end of the section? And he went and he looked, and it turns out, yes, this is what was going on with these people who are at the top of the list that we see here. So the first person on the list reported changing one answer at the beginning. We don't know if that means number 1 or number 2, but at the beginning of the test, they changed an answer from incorrect to correct. The second person changed question number 2 from incorrect to correct. The third person didn't give any information, so we don't know. And then the fourth person on the list, the person who got the 83, didn't actually change any answers. So we didn't look beyond that. We just looked at the first 4. So what's going on here? Why is this possible? Also, how can you get an 80 when the top score is 90 if you only get 1 wrong, even if you did change 1 from incorrect to correct? So here's what's happening. The thing that can really bring your score down is missing a question that's easier relative to the scoring level that you are prepared to get or that you're trying to get. So it's the easier questions that can bring you down. I'll call them test killers. If you get a couple of easy questions right, that's changing the trajectory of your test, and that's basically lowering the difficulty level of the questions that you're going to see relative to somebody else who didn't miss those easier questions. So when you go back at the end of the test and you change an answer from incorrect to correct, you do get the credit for that question. So for that question, you get the full credit. It doesn't change because you got it right later as opposed to getting it right when you first saw the question. But what did already change and can't be changed now is that when you got that, like let's say you get the first question wrong and it's an easier level question relative to what you're capable of scoring because you're capable of pushing your score higher. The second question that you get and the third question that you get, those questions are going to be lower level questions than they would have been if you had answered that question correctly in the first place. So if you could somehow have two people who get they can't get the exact same test, that's the point, because every answer you give means a different question is coming next. But if you have one person who gets the first question wrong and somebody who gets the first question right, the question 2 is going to be different in difficulty, and probably the question 3 as well. It's going to take a little bit until the person who got the first question wrong could essentially catch back up. They have more work to do to catch back up. The first person's just already on that upward trajectory. So by the time you get to the end of the section, you've seen overall your mix of questions is easier than it would have been if you had just gotten that question right in the first place. And that's going to lower your score to some extent. So that's one thing that's going on. The next thing that's really important to understand is that they changed the scoring scale, and the effect of the change in the scoring scale essentially was to stretch out the available scores in a way that feels really weird because we're all used to the old scoring scale on the old test. On the old test, the top score was a 51. A score of 45 or higher was good. A score of 47 or higher was very good. A score of 49 or higher was excellent, right, out of 51. And so I'm guessing that most people have looked up the concordance tables, but I'm just going to remember concordance table is a table that tells you what the score on the old test compares to the score on the new test. But I'm just going to remind people of what this is. So on the little screenshot we had earlier that was showing somebody who got a score of 80, a score of 80, thank you. A score of 80 is comparable to a 47 or a 48 on the old test, which is a really good score. And a score of 81 is equivalent to a 48. A score of 83 is equivalent to a 49. So we're starting to get to really high scores on the old scale. They don't feel as high on the new scale because they're further away from 90. Like they're just simply more numbers in between. So it feels a lot lower, but those are actually, like on the old test, people would have been really happy with a 47 or a 48 or a 49. Those are good scores. So part of it is just our own human perception that it feels worse because the scoring scale is just more stretched out because they just decided to change the scoring scale, but it doesn't actually change what it means. And then the third thing that Abhijit and I talked about ahead of time was it's also the case, so they shortened the test. There are fewer questions in each section.
Right.
And essentially that means there's not as much room for error. And that's true on the GMAT and the GRE both shortened their exams right around the same time a couple of years ago. And so on both exams, that does mean that there's less room for error simply because there are fewer questions to prove yourself in each section of the test. And so if you combine what we've talked about so far with, like, if you miss 2 questions that are the easiest questions that they tossed at you or easier questions that they tossed at you, that's going to bring your score down more than if you miss 2 questions. On my exam, when I took the new official exam, I also got 2 questions wrong. My final score was an 87 in the section. I didn't change any questions from wrong to right. And my 2 questions wrong were the 2 questions at the very end of the test. They were the last 2 questions in the section. So basically I got everything right the first time, right up until the very end of the section. And then I got a couple questions wrong. And so that kind of behavior that you're seeing is consistent with how the old test worked as well. If you got easier questions wrong, it hurt your ability. It made it harder for you to climb to the highest levels on the test. And the same thing is happening here. So it hasn't actually changed, although I know it feels like it has.
I mean, obviously, it is something that all of us are quite puzzled about. And
Yeah.
since we were discussing about easier versus difficult questions, right? As an extension to this, I wanted to ask, so how important is the first 10 questions on the paper? Do they hold utmost importance? Do they determine the entire rest of the paper for me, or how does it
Right.
work?
So here's the interesting. So this was also talked about on the prior test, right? So the interesting thing here again is that that's not quite the right thing. It's a misconception that the questions earlier in the exam are worth more. It's not actually based on the location of the questions. What it's based on is the difficulty level of the questions. And so when you start, if you're capable of scoring higher, so if you're capable of scoring at those top level scores, then where you start the test, you're going to be at questions that are below your ability to answer the questions because you're starting somewhere in the middle, right? So you're getting, relative to what you're capable of doing, you're getting easier questions towards the beginning of the section, or you're more likely to get questions that are relatively easier for you because you're capable of lifting your score a lot higher. So that's essentially, I would call it the danger zone, in the sense that, again, if you miss an easier question, that's going to pull you down. It's going to it's pulling you back down the hill, and now you have more to climb to get yourself back up to the top of the hill, right? And so it's not that it's not about the questions being at the beginning. It's about it's about how easy or difficult they are. And on the old exam, you were most likely, if you were a higher scoring student, you're capable of scoring higher, you were most likely to see those questions right at the beginning of the section. And so that led to the perception that that it was like the location, but technically it was about the difficulty of the questions. GMAC, I was at a conference last year, and one of their psychometricians spoke and said that, yes, they did try to rectify that because they recognized that as essentially something that they didn't love about how the exam worked. And so they implemented something. They didn't describe how they did it, and that's fair. It's their algorithm, and they don't have to tell us. But they implemented something that essentially allowed them, as best I understand it, to spread out the questions more, so that we're not getting the easier questions necessarily clustered right at the very beginning of the section. And so what that means is we can encounter some easier, even if we're doing well, we can encounter some lower level questions a bit later in the section. And so all of this is like, great, so what do I do now? What you do now is the same as you would always have done on the old test, and what you want to do on this test, which is a question pops up on the screen. You're trying to evaluate pretty quickly, what is it telling me? Do I understand what's going on? Do I know what it's asking me to do? And do I think I can get to the right answer in a reasonable amount of time? And if I can, great, and I'm going to go ahead and do it. And if it looks too hard, or it looks like it's going to take too long, and I might blow up the rest of my section by trying to invest too much in this question, then I'm going to pick something and I'm going to move on. And now maybe I'm going to bookmark it to come back and look at it later, which I wouldn't have been an option on the old exam. But really, it's not, it's the difficulty level. And the thing is, of course, you don't know which questions are easier or harder. They don't tell you. And so then this becomes also what you're doing when you're getting ready for the test, is you're making sure that you don't have any big holes in your foundation. We all have strengths and weaknesses. It's okay to have strengths and weaknesses, but you basically want a pretty good baseline across all the topics, all the question types, so that you don't have one thing that can really torpedo your score because you're getting an easier question wrong. And then from there, yeah, you can have some strengths and weaknesses. If you miss a harder question, it's not going to kill your score. It's just not going to let you lift further. But if you miss that easier question, and you miss too many because there's not that many questions in each section, then that really is what's going to be the test killer, is going to kill your score. And so you're looking to have that really good, solid, and you're also looking to, when you know how to answer a question in a reasonable amount of time, you get that question. In other words, you don't start being like, oh, I'm going to do this in my head so that I can save some time, so that I can spend it on that really hard question. Because now you're going to make a careless mistake, and you don't go, oh, I'm going to do this in 2 steps, even though it really should take 4 steps, because I want to save time for some other harder question, because now you're going to make a careless mistake. So this is the old sports thing of keep your eye on the ball. You're about to kick that ball into the goal. Do not take your eye off the ball. You got it. Go get that point. And then deal with the other, deal with the next one when it comes up, basically.
Okay. I think that helps us understand the scoring algorithm as well as the whole thing about how important is the first 10 questions. And since we've had a reasonable number of people join us in the last 10 minutes or so, I just want to reiterate that we are here to discuss a bunch of questions. The next topic that we will be covering is the section adaptiveness. Post that, we will be covering about changes in the new curriculum. So stay tuned. We have Stacey Copens here from Manhattan Prep. And if you want to join us for more such sessions, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon. So now moving on to the next section, right? Let's discuss what section adaptiveness is all about. What is it and how exactly does it work?
So this is also new for the new exam. They implemented something that does actually already exist on the GRE, for example. When you start your first section of the exam, your first question of the first section is just a medium level question, and then they go from there. When you start your second section of the exam, they might bump your starting level like a little bit higher or a little bit lower, but it's really not very much. You can kind of think of it as when you start the first section, your first question can be in this kind of range. And it's immediate, like this is exactly in the middle of the range. It could be a little bit easier, a little bit harder, but it's somewhere in the middle of the range. If you do really well on that first section, they're going to just take that into account. You're still going to be in the middle range somewhere, but they might just start you here instead of here because they have a little bit of information about you from that first section. Or if you didn't do so great in that first section, they might start you a little bit lower, like down here. They're just doing this essentially to optimize, like they're still choosing from within what they would do, but instead of choosing randomly from within there, they're using the little bit of information that they have about you so far. Again, I've talked to GMAC about this. It's a minor effect, and it's something that, like, let's say you didn't do as well in the first section as you had been prepared to do. It was a rough first section, or for whatever reason, you didn't do your best in that section. You're going to start like slightly lower on the next section than you might otherwise have. But as long as you can kind of like take a deep breath and let that first section go and do what you've prepared yourself to do on the test, you will actually get that back really quickly, like within a question or two, and then you'll be doing what you're capable of doing in the test. So this starting point, it's not enough or this adaptivity is not enough to change, like to pull your score down essentially, or but on the converse, to really push your score up. It's not enough to make a huge difference in the end. It's just a way for them to optimize where they start, which question they start you with. So mostly I'm telling people don't worry about it. I don't even think about it when I'm advising my students about which section to start with. It doesn't matter.
Because you just mentioned it, right? That is something that frightens most of us. We're always trying to figure what is the best order in which we should choose our sections. So, and an ideal case scenario would be that I go from my strongest to weakest, or should it be vice versa? And how exactly does it matter? What section do I put first? So how do we take that decision?
Yes, I literally just had this conversation with my students last night in class because they're about to take their second practice test. So the way that I think, I'm going to tell you what I think is best for most people. And then there's like a certain group of people who maybe should do a little bit differently. So we'll talk about that second. I actually don't think about it as strongest versus weakest in terms of evaluating your sections. I think of it as the sections that take the most mental energy and the sections that take the least mental energy, which may correspond to strongest and weakest, or it may not. It depends on the person. So I recommend that. So the test is shorter now. It's 2 hours and 15 minutes, but that's still a long time to be really pushing your brain. It's still a marathon to take this test, and it still gets tiring as you go on. So I actually recommend that people start the exam with the section that they find the most mentally challenging. That first section is the section that you need to bring the most brain power to do.
Right.
And then the second section is the section that you find the least mentally challenging. And that's to give yourself some recovery time to feel good coming out of the most mentally challenging section, and to give yourself a little bit of a break between that section and the third section, which is going to be your middle mentally challenging section. So you kind of like start out strong, you start out really strong, you're pushing yourself hard. You get a little bit of a break in the middle with both your least mentally challenging section and the actual break. You get a break in the middle of the test. And then you finish up with that middle section. So for most people, that's what I recommend. The caveat to that would be if there's a particular section on the test that you are just really dreading and you know you're going to be thinking about that section the entire time until you're done with that section, right? So a lot of people, me included, have test anxiety when taking these tests. It's a really
Right.
filled
Right.
situation, right? So if you're like, I'm just going to be thinking about this section the entire time, and then you know what? Go get that section out of the way first. Just do it, get it done, forget it, put it behind you, and then go do the 2 sections that you feel better about, knowing that you can take a big sigh of relief because it's behind you and you're done, and move on. So that's what I would recommend.
Okay. But my takeaway from that is that most mental energy and then least mental energy followed with the last.
Most, least, middle, and mental energy, which may or may not be the same as the score.
Strongest to weakest.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Okay. So once again, before we move on to the third section of the session, right? I want to reiterate, we are discussing certain concerns that all of us applicants have when it comes to the GMAT. And the next section that we're going to discuss has something to do with the changes in the exam curriculum. Stay tuned for more such sessions. We have about 52 people with us, and we have more such upcoming episodes where we'll be covering a bunch of different topics so that the GMAT becomes slightly easier and simpler for us to deal with. Now, like I said, the third topic that I want to touch upon is the curriculum, right? We all know that there have been certain major changes. For instance, IR has expanded into data insights. We know that geometry and sentence correction, these are 2 topics that are no more a part of the curriculum. So if we were to divide GMAT applicants into 2 broad categories, which is STEM and non-STEM, how do you think these changes have affected these 2 pools of students?
Yeah, that's a great question. When the changes were first announced, my immediate reaction was, oh, this will be better for STEM than non-STEM, or people who like math. This will be better for them because data insights is becoming part of your total score. And so that's basically increasing the proportion. It's no longer 50-50. It's maybe like 55-45, because of course data insights mixes math and verbal. And then we started getting into it, and they released the practice tests, and we started taking practice tests, and we started seeing what was going on. And the interesting thing is, I actually think that the net effect is the same, because there's also an advantage for the non-STEM folks, which is that the math is now much more of the math is what I'm going to call real world math, as opposed to textbook math. Right. And so first of all of the data insights section, including data sufficiency, which moved over into data insights, none of these are pure math, what are called pure math problems, meaning I'm just giving you math and nothing else. All of them have a story attached to it.
Right.
And so the story allows you to get into somebody who's non-STEM, right? Like the story gives you the context of what's going on. It's got words that you're trying to interpret. And so that actually helps that group, I think, more than just the pure math, here, do this math problem setup. And I found personally, so even on the quant section, which can have pure math, on my practice exams and on my real exam, I was able to get through that. I was surprised. I was able to get through that section with a lot less, like, I'm going to call it like plug and chug type math, just like, okay, I got to write this down and just do a bunch of math to get the answer.
Right.
I did still have some math like that, of course, that does still exist. But there were a lot of ways, and even on questions that looked like pure math, there were other ways to approach them, which was unusual. Like there were ways to still estimate, or in certain situations, choose smart numbers where in the past you might not have been able to. Like it was really interesting. So I amended my opinion on that I actually don't think there's an advantage for STEM folks. I think that the changes that were made are better for everybody compared to the old exam. And I actually do think that overall, it doesn't matter whether you're STEM or non-STEM. I will say the one thing that does freak a lot of people out is that data insights is part of your score, which means data analytics. And my response to that really is, okay, but you want to go to business school? You have to look at data every day in business school. And in fact, in a business career nowadays, you're basically looking at data every day, interpreting data, right? So if that's something that you're nervous about, it's understandable if you're nervous about that. But if it's something that you're nervous about, then that's an opportunity to go get better and feel more comfortable with that before you start business school. You don't want to go into business school on day one being like, oh, I'm not sure about data, because you're going to be doing it every day. So use your preschool test studies to really start to feel more comfortable with data analytics if that's an area that you don't have as much experience in. Just, and then school will be better itself, which is the more important part.
Right. Okay. So that helps understand a lot of things better now. And for anyone else who's watching, if you all have certain questions, any queries with regard to what we just discussed, you all can put it down in the chat section, and we will be sure to take those up once we're done discussing our questions. And because you mentioned about data insights and STEM, right, and math as a hardcore concept, this is something that all of us think about all the time. If there's any way to know that, okay, these are the topics that have utmost importance, and if I just cover this, I will be okay. Because all of us need that reassurance, and we often feel overwhelmed with the kind of topics or the portion or the entire thing at large, right? So, are there a bunch of topics that have gained prominence in quant and verbal both?
So they
Something that
haven't.
we should specifically focus on.
Yeah. So as best we can tell, they haven't changed the focus in terms of, so first of all, in verbal, there's no topics left, right? Because sentence correction is gone. So there's no facts on verbal anymore. It's just the skills or the different kinds of questions that they ask. They haven't really changed, as far as we can tell, the proportion of like how many inference questions am I asking versus strengthen, or how many quadratic questions might there be versus just linear equations. That seems to be relatively steady. Because there are more data insights, like because that section is now a part of the exam, you could have called data insights nothing before because it was a separate score, so nobody cared about it.
Right.
So yes, stats, like there's more stats on the exam simply because those questions count now towards our total score. But I'm going to go back to something I said a little bit earlier too, which is there's a range of question types, there's a range of facts and rules and skills. You want to be pretty good. Your first task is to get pretty good across everything so that you're not taken down by an easier level question in any of those categories. From there, you're looking to push your strengths wherever you can. For the weaknesses, okay, you're not going to push those as high, but you're looking to push their strengths wherever you can. And the sort of major categories of things that are more frequent on the math side, definitely stats in general, percents and fractions, and then things like linear equations, both that they're given to you, but actually even more important, equations that they're giving to you in words, and you have to figure out how to create the equations. So basically translating. That's everywhere in the test, especially again in the data insight section. The ability basically in general to take words and figure out what that means in terms of math.
Numbers, yes.
Yeah, all of that. And I would say in general, like as an overall topic, number properties is probably a bit less important. It used to be pretty heavily tested in data sufficiency on pure math problems, and they took those out. So that doesn't exist anymore. You can still see number properties in the test, but it's just not quite as prominent as it used to be.
Okay. I think our conclusion can be drawn that a lot of the math is based on practicality and what could be used in real life,
exactly,
as opposed to just being confined to textbooks. All right. And finally, before we take up questions from the audience, something to make it more fun. If you had to define all the changes that the GMAT has done in the Focus edition, but only in one sentence, how would you define it? I know it's a challenge, which is why I said we want to make it.
That's a really good question. I would say that the new GMAT is much more targeted to business school. What it's doing, like they took who cares about geometry, who cares about sentence correction in business school, right? And by the way, who cares about pure math, because you're going to have Excel in the real world.
Right.
So what they've done is they've literally targeted the kinds of skills that they want to test. Can you think about these concepts? Can you reason about both analytical concepts and quantitative concepts in real world contexts, which is business school? So this test is really, I think, a good measure for what business schools want to see in their applicants.
Okay, so basically we're all getting more prepped and equipped to handle what business school will throw our way.
I think so. I actually think that this test helps, like, obviously you have to take it to get into business school, but I actually think that not everything, but that a decent percentage of what you're prepping will in fact help you when you're in business school as well.
Okay. So not only will our prep help us score a great score, but also help us ahead in college. And I'm sure that is some extra motivation for those of us who are preparing. And moving on to the audience questions, we have about, I think, 2 questions here, right? Just going through the first one, we have Avinash Garg who's asked whether sections like quant, verbal are also adaptive or only questions in one section are.
So the questions within one section, the questions are what's called question adaptive, which means each question is chosen based on your collective performance to that point in that section alone. If you're on question 15 in quant, it's based on how you did on the first 14 questions, what they're going to choose for question 15. They also take a little bit of information at the start of the second and third sections. So where they start you in the second and third sections can be up a tiny bit or down a tiny bit based on how you did on the prior sections that you've completed. But that does not carry into the rest of the section. Once they start gathering information in that section about you, they're using just the information in that section to make the later decisions about which questions to give you.
Okay. I think that was a good question to distinguish between how sections are adaptive differently, or within one section itself are the questions adaptive. So I think that helps us answer that. We also have a question from Abhijit where he's asking, what's the reasonable preparation duration for an average candidate?
So
how
this
many
is
months, weeks, years?
So there's 2 big variables to this. It depends upon how much of a score gain you're trying to get. So basically, where are you starting and where are you trying to get to? And it depends upon how much you're studying every week. So those are the 2 big variables. So most people are going to be studying between like 2 and 6 months. That's the average. And that will, again, if you're going for either not as much of a score increase or you're studying a ton, it might be closer to the 2-month end of the range. If you're going for a really high score or a really high score increase, or you're not studying, maybe you have a job where you're working 50, 60 hours a week or whatever. And so you're not studying as much every week. And so then you might be at the higher end of the range. And I will just add one more thing there too, which is the higher you're trying to go, the harder it is. So every additional 10 points higher that you're trying to go, it's not the same 10 points. 505 to 515 is easier than 605 to 615 is easier than 7.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So 2 to 6 months is what
2 to 6
on
months
average
is average for most people. Yeah. So, and again, higher end if you're looking for a higher score and or you're not studying, every single day of the week, possibly towards the lower end if you can study every day and you're not looking necessarily for a super high score increase.
Right. Okay. We have another question here. I'll just quickly read through it. I believe we have already answered this in parts, but if there is something that you would like to add, right? Ritvik asks, I have seen people getting 26 percentile in quant with just 3 mistakes. This only happens in quant. Why is that the case? Is the quant adaptability different from other sections?
And so the adaptability is not different now. The scoring scale so first of all, the scoring scale is not exactly the same. Like each of them is scored up to 90, but if you look at the percentiles of the 3 sections next to each other, they're not the same. If you look at the number of questions you're getting right or wrong, it's certain. So don't look at it across verbal and quant and DI as though they're the same, even though technically they're all 3 using the same 60 to 90 scoring scale. Just look at each one by itself. And then, yes, so basically what's happening is if you're getting those 3 mistakes and you're getting down to 26 percentile, which is around maybe like a 74 in the section, you probably also had 1 or more questions that you were changing from incorrect to correct. So you were actually looking at maybe 4 or 5 mistakes as you were going through out of 21 questions in that section. And again, if those questions or some of them were easier questions, then that would have pulled down your whole trajectory. So it would have pulled down the other questions that you were earning. So that can happen. And the answer to that, again, is you want that really solid level across everything so that you're not, and you want a really good, consistent process and you're not rushing when you see what you think is an easy question so that you're not making careless mistakes on easier level questions. If you can not miss any of the easier level questions, then you're putting yourself in a really good position to get a good score.
Okay. And also in the first initial part of the session, we covered the entire scoring anomalies and percentile algorithm, etc. So feel free to go back and watch that session. I will just take one last question, since this is something that we didn't touch upon much. Time management tips. Is there, in terms of completing the test, right? How do we make sure that we stay on time? We do not spend more than required amount
Yes.
on one section, on a question. Any
Mhm.
tips there?
All of that. So a couple of different things that you can do here. So part of this is, what this really comes down to is decision making. You're allowing yourself to stay on a question. You're thinking like, oh, but I should know how to do this, or I'm almost there, or if I just try this, maybe I'll get it, or whatever that might be. And then all of a sudden you realize you spent 5 minutes on this one question, and you've just blown your time for the whole section. So there are a couple different things you can do here. So first of all, when you're practicing outside of a test condition and you're just doing one question at a time or a small set of questions at a time, you're practicing per question timing management. One of the things that I recommend is literally starting, like, grab your phone, have your phone with you, start the timer on your phone. Don't look at it. Guess when you think it's been a minute and look at it again.
Okay.
And this is whether you're studying for the GMAT or not. This could be while you're at work. This could be while you're like, whatever you're doing. Do whatever you're doing. Don't look at your phone, look at it. Do that 10 more times throughout the day. And see, like, are you all over the map? Do you have no idea how long a minute is? Are you usually too fast? Are you usually too slow? Like, so figure that out and just keep doing that every day for the next like 2 weeks until you get okay at telling about how long a minute is. And by okay, I mean you're consistently somewhere between 40 seconds and a minute, 20 seconds. So it's pretty wide range, but it's not like it's been 3 minutes and you think it's only been a minute. So what you're trying to do is just give your brain a sense of like, okay, it's been around a minute since I last thought about, how much time I'm taking. That will help you just to have more presence within a question itself, of like not getting lost in a question for 5 minutes. The next thing for per question is that thing I referenced of, but I should know how to do this. Anytime you find yourself thinking, but I should know how, you don't know how. Because if you knew how, you would just be doing it. You wouldn't be thinking, oh, but I should know how, or but I studied this, and what was that again? Or if I just spent a little more, any of those thoughts mean you're lost in this problem, because you wouldn't be thinking those thoughts in the first place if you actually knew what you were doing. So I've trained myself essentially that as soon as I think those things, I'm like, oh, look, I'm thinking that. Okay, I'm out. I'm picking my favorite letter out of A, B, C, D, and E is B. I have no idea why, but that's my favorite letter. And so I've got that in my brain. It's like, as soon as I realize, oop, I got lost in this problem, I pick B, I move on. Unless I've eliminated B already for some reason, in which case I pick some other random letter. So as soon as you start thinking that, you train yourself that, nope, that literally means I'm lost. Pick an answer. I'm done immediately. No more seconds on this question. Bigger picture for the whole section, you want to make sure that you're using a timing strategy across the section that gives you periodic times that you're checking against the clock. Not every question, because that'll stress you out too much, but every certain number of questions. And so we've got something on our website. I'll give you the link and you can post it later. There's a time management article that gives you, for each section, set times that you'll check. Basically, it's after question 4, after question 8, after question 12, you're going to compare where you want to be to the time that's on the clock. And that allows you to make adjustments as you go, so that if you do get sucked into a question and spend too much time on that, you'll know before you're at the end of the section suddenly realizing that you have 1 minute left for 5 questions.
Right.
You can take action and just bail on a question, sacrifice a question in the middle of the test to get yourself back on time. So those are the 2 big things there. And like I said, I'll give Shreya the link so that they can go post it in the YouTube channel with the article, so everyone can go take a look at that.
Sure. Thank you. And we'll just take one last question before wrapping this up. Jaskirat is asking, after solving all the OG questions, what should we do to make our foundation stronger?
Mm-hmm. So my first question for you is, what did you do when you were solving those OG questions? Because in the big OG, there's like 1,300 questions, and there's a lot to learn from them. So one of the biggest mistakes that I see people making is that they solve lots of questions, but they don't actually spend substantial time learning from those questions. When you're solving a question, you're not actually learning anything. Right. While you're solving the question, you're just trying to remember everything that you already know and use it to try to answer this question. Where you learn is after you're done with the question. when you're going back over it and you're looking stuff up in your book, or you're comparing it to another question from 2 weeks ago that kind of reminded you of this question or whatever, or asking yourself things like, oh, I did this way, but I could have done it that way. And which way is better? Well, let me try it this way now too. And then compare the two methods. I can spend 5 times as long as it took me to do the question, reviewing the question, and still be learning stuff. So in general, if you're not spending at least twice as much time reviewing a question as you spent doing it in the first place, and that includes the questions you got right, by the way, then you're not spending enough time actually learning from these questions. So first I would just ask yourself, Jessica, did you actually learn everything that you could learn from these questions? Even if you got it right, there might be a faster way to do it. Did you go figure that out? You can't know until you actually go back and try solving it again, or really dig into it. So make sure you're getting the most out of those questions before you move on, because that's the single biggest mistake I see people make in their studies. If you really have learned everything that you can from those, and then you're still looking to make your score stronger, basically from there, my next question would be, do you know what you need to do, but you're falling short under testing conditions because your time management is suboptimal? Maybe it's not that you need to get better at the questions, but you need to get better at your decisions on the test, and that's what's holding your score back. So we would dig into that to figure that out. If it is the case that there are still holes in topics or whatever, then I would literally be moving on to the other OG books. So there's the 3 other section-specific OG books. That's where I would go next, or to they have an online question set as well, or I would go there. But yeah, more official questions. Official questions are the best, but make sure you're actually learning from them.
Review and go back and practice.
Exactly.
So spend time solving the questions, but spend more time reviewing.
And there's so many questions you can ask yourself when you're reviewing. So first of all, there's of course just the basic, do I understand why the right answer is right? And do I understand any mistakes that I might have made? There are also things like, so first of all, there's always a different way to do it. Is that way any better for me? Especially on math questions, there's usually 2 or 3 completely different approaches you could use to that problem. The one that you think of first might not actually be the best way for you. It might just be what you thought of first.
Yes.
There's also things like figuring out how to guess. Like if I had to make a guess on a question like this one, how would I do it? And here's the weird thing. It's actually often easier to learn how to make guesses on questions that you got right, because you understand how the question works. And so you learn how to do it. And you say, okay, if I saw a harder one of this one that I couldn't actually do, what would my thought process be to make a guess? And you can figure that out. And now, if you get a harder one of the same type, you're like, okay, now I have an idea of how to make a guess on this kind of problem. So there's so many things you can be learning from these problems.
Okay, so with that, thank you for your lovely answers. You've been so extensive in not just the first half of the session, but also with all the questions our applicants had. So thank you so much for doing this. I would like to remind everyone that this is just the first episode. We have 4 more lined up to discuss similar points of contention, concerns, anything at all that usually is something that would worry a GMAT applicant, or controversial topics that nobody stops debating about because we're all so confused. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to Manhattan Prep and to Stacey for doing this for us. Make sure that you subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon, and we'll see you for the next episode. So thank you.